Hey guys, what's up? It's Ripe again. In today's video, my stepdad pulled a gun on me and shot me to steal my $3.4 million inheritance. Here is what happened. The title story starts like this. I had to learn the hard way that sometimes the nicest people end up with complete a-holes. My mother was easily the kindest person I knew, which made it so much harder for me to understand why she chose to be with my stepfather, Bill. Bill was the kind of husband who would show up drunk every other day. He has never been able to keep a job for longer than 3 months. By the time my dad passed away, I had already moved out. While I was glad that I never had to live with him, I felt horrible that my mother had to. I had tried talking her out of the marriage numerous times, but at some point I realized that I had to respect her decision. I stopped going around their house as much as I used to, but my old neighbor and childhood friend still gave me updates on what was happening. Each time he called, the stories got progressively wilder. Bill showing up in the middle of the night and waking up the entire neighborhood due to his drunk antics had become a regular occurrence. His car had numerous dents in the shape of mailboxes, and he would try to pick fights with the calmest Labrador that stayed next door. They started keeping the dog inside the house to protect him from Bill. The worst story was probably when he used one of the mailboxes of the neighbor as a toilet. Anyway, when my mother got sick, he was barely at the hospital. Even in her last moments, he was not there. A part of me was glad that he wasn't. She deserved a peaceful death, and no life with Bill around could be anything close to peaceful. I was devastated that I wouldn't be able to see my mom anymore, but I thought to myself that at least I won't have to deal with Bill ever again. I let myself think that I was done with my stepfather for exactly 3 days before he proved that getting rid of a parasite like him would not be easy. The house that they were living in belonged to my mother. There were days I thought that he only married her for the house, but my mother was smart enough to not let him in on the inheritance. A $3.4 million inheritance was most certainly not a small sum. She was extremely disappointed with him in her last days, and she made sure her will did not mention his name at all. I had texted him and called multiple times to inform him that he had to vacate the house, but he chose to ignore everything. My old neighbor also tried speaking to Bill, but he either locked himself up in the house or locked the house up and left to get drunk. He refused to speak to anyone, and every single person in the neighborhood wanted him gone. My mother was the only reason they tolerated him. The only thing left to do was show up myself and get him to leave. When I arrived at the house, it was locked and his car was missing from the driveway. I parked mine and used a spare key that I had to open the house. I then walked into a scene of absolute chaos. The house was in shambles, empty bottles and cans littered the floor, and furniture was overturned. The stench of stale beer and cigarette smoke was overwhelming. I covered my nose and mouth as I made my way through the mess. Most of the things in the house belonged to my mother, and they were here before I moved out. I figured his clothes might be his only possession and decided to toss them out to send a message. As I rummaged through the house, I heard the sound of a car pulling up in the driveway. I looked out the window and saw Bill's beat-up truck. My heart sank as I realized what he was probably up to. I hurried down the stairs and saw Bill walking up to the house with a folder in his hand. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice shaking with anger. "I am here to claim what's rightfully mine," he said, holding up the folder. "These documents prove that your mother left everything to me." I snatched the folder from him, flipped through the pages, and they were clearly BS and forged, and I knew that my mother would never have left anything to him. I asked him to follow me and took him to my car. I pulled out the real documents from the dashboard and showed them to him, hoping that he would see reason. To no one's surprise, he grew more agitated and began yelling. The commotion caused the neighbors to step out of their houses to see what was happening. It was clear that he was drunk once more. He could barely stand straight. Instead of backing down, he pulled out a gun from his pocket and pointed it at me. "You are lying," he said. "I know that she left everything to me, and I'll do whatever it takes to get what's mine." I knew that I had to act fast. I lunged at him, grabbing his arm and twisting it until he dropped the gun. It clattered to the ground and I quickly kicked it away. However, Bill was not finished. He swung at me with his other arm, trying to knock me down. I dodged his punch and landed a hard blow to his stomach, causing him to double over in pain. As he gasped for air, I grabbed the gun and aimed it at him. "You're done," I said. "I'm calling the cops and you're going to jail." But before I could make the call, Bill made one last desperate move. He dashed to his truck that was parked right behind my car. He pulled out another pistol. I was stunned for a second. I still had the first gun pointed at him, but I was completely unprepared to actually fire it. He turned around immediately and fired at me. I screamed in pain as the bullet grazed my foot. He clearly had every intention to kill me, but thanks to his drunken stupor, he missed anything vital. Before he could get ready to shoot again, I pulled the trigger and the bullet hit him in the leg. He fell to the ground, clutching his wound and screaming in pain. The people gathered around us quickly and called an ambulance as well as the cops. It didn't take very long for them to arrive. When they did, they took Bill away in handcuffs and I breathed a sigh of relief. It was finally over, the house was mine and I could move on with my life. But most of all, I was glad I protected my parents' hard-earned money from a leech like him. Once my foot was completely healed, I pressed charges against Bill. He ended up getting locked away for numerous charges, including forgery, theft and attempted murder. The last charge really got him and ensured that he would not be seeing the outside of a prison for a very long time. And yeah, ripe stars, it is always so sad to see when there is an inheritance, there's almost always some kind of entitled person that tries to steal it. Money can really bring out the worst in people. It is so sad to see. Anyway, if you liked the story, please don't forget to like the video and maybe even leave a comment because that would help me tremendously. Thank you so much. And the next one is titled, "Dumb Neighbor Just Deserts." So we have a next door neighbor who does not like us for no apparent reason. This is a vacation home for them and we have never said a single word to or interacted with them ever. They seem to think that we live in an HOA, which we don't, and call the city code enforcement on us over their perceived shortcoming in our lifestyle. We let our yard pretty much grow wild, whereas theirs is meticulously landscaped and professionally tended. We have 6-foot walls between houses so they cannot see much of anything in our yard without trying, such as climbing a ladder to take pictures to send the city to lodge a complaint. So the city investigates, finds nothing wrong and closes the complaint. The last complaint happened a few months ago when we were doing some legally permitted construction. The neighbor calls the city, they come out and find no issues. Apparently he was upset with this outcome and he made more complaints, of which only one was valid. He complained about our vehicle parked on the street not having a current registration sticker. Parking enforcement came out and put a sticker telling me to fix the problem or move it within 3 days. Apparently my current license plate sticker had been scraped off. While out front, I noticed my neighbor's new motorhome parked in front of his house. It's illegal in the city to park a motorhome on the street. Normally I couldn't care less about it, but this seemed like an opportunity that I could not pass up. I asked the parking guy, what about that thing? He said there was no complaint about it, so I said, I'm complaining. I watched as he took pictures and wrote out the parking ticket and tow order. I then watched as, about an hour later, the tow truck eagerly hooked it up and whisked it away to their impound lot. And yeah, ripe stars, that has to feel so amazingly satisfying to get your neighbor towed, especially when he's such a douchebag. Have you ever gotten one of your neighbors towed? Let us know in the comments. And the next one is titled, "Never Mess with a New Mother." Background: we live in a country that needs a lot of improvement on laws, their application and enforcement. We're a lot better than a few years back, but still, sometimes people can get away with forging some types of documents like medical records, education degrees, etc. Also, English is not our main language, so job titles, degrees and other details are translated to their best equivalents. According to our country's labor laws, all female employees are entitled to 3 months paid maternity leave. Employers at their own expense are expected to cover for the employees on maternity leave, usually with temporary workers. Severance payments are mandatory when firing employees without justified cause, crime, fraud, etc. with more than 3 months on their jobs, so that's a time limit to be considered a temporary worker. Severance payment calculation is rather complicated, but for firing people employed 4 years or less, it usually boils down to about 4 months of salary. To fire pregnant women, employers have to pay them 6 months of salary on top of the severance payment they're entitled to. If an employee quits voluntarily, they effectively forfeit all benefits previously mentioned. My wife has been working for a non-profit for 10 years now. I don't want to give out too much detail, but the company deals with, among other things, basic women's healthcare, and the company has 3 locations within 10 or less miles from each other. I own a small tech support firm, and we've been offering services to this company for about the same time, hence my small involvement. We actually met through this professional relation. This is her second kid, my 4th and first baby girl. The main characters are my dear wife, the main role, temporary witch, my dear wife's nemesis and Bane director of operations, my wife's boss. Then the administrative director, boss's boss, also a woman, and now onto the story. So my wife is a very easygoing introvert person. She can be shy when you first meet her, and on first impression she gives out a vibe of being a pushover. In reality, she takes no crap from anyone, including or especially me. She was hired as the company's receptionist originally, but thanks to her hard work ethics and professionalism, which I've witnessed myself even before dating her, she is being promoted constantly. Her apparent pushover personality has been a reoccurring theme on her job since for years she worked as an office manager in charge of overseeing the company's vehicles, managing the drivers, janitors, dealing with some external contractors, etc. out of the receptionist desk, and this is a small to medium company. Sometimes when a new manager was hired, they tried to make her run phone errands, set appointments, pay bills, etc. and other petty stuff like serving coffee, etc. You usually have a low-level secretary director of operations thinking she was only a receptionist. She promptly called for a staff meeting every time, having the director of operations set these a-holes straight. She foresaw the company's need of having a human resources manager, so she talked me into helping her, financially and with domestic duties, get a master's degree in human resources 3 years ago because she is a business major. I contributed to the cost and did my best to take care of the kids and the house when she was in class. She graduated with very good grades and the investment paid off. The position was created last year following the advice by external assessors who promptly recommended the company to give my wife the job with a significant pay raise involved. A few months later we got pregnant again, so my wife and the director of operations hired this temp girl, temp witch, to cover for my wife during her maternity leave. My wife was very weared out on her last days of pregnancy when she trained the temp witch, and she also may have commented how relieved she would be without work stress for a few months while enjoying our baby girl. Temp witch probably got my wife's pushover vibe as well. Temp witch turned out to be an opportunistic, backstabbing skank that thought she could take over my wife's position. She also turned out to be somewhat stupid, as a weird coincidence my employees knew her. A few months prior, she was employed as a consumer electronic sales girl on another company that uses our services, and they knew she was not in fact a human resources or business major as she claimed to be. She was a marketing major fresh out of university. At the time, my wife let it slide, didn't alert the company, as she was after all a temp employee, and exposing her will mean my wife would have to either scramble to vet and train another candidate in less than a week or reschedule her C-section for a week later. While my wife was on leave, some of her co-workers started alerting her in private that the temp witch was starting to get more and more comfortable into my wife's position. Among other things, overriding some of the directives and procedures my wife had put in place, trying to implement her, often inadequate and wrong own, and giving employees advice and directions that directly contradicted my wife's instructions. Also giving hell to some of the suppliers the company and my wife have been satisfactorily dealing with for years. Temp witch had the audacity to change the email footer on my wife's computer, as well as wording on the emails themselves to appear as she was the official HR manager, not my wife. She was specifically told that she had to let everyone know that she was acting on behalf of the actual HR manager. She did this on specific emails to certain employees and suppliers, changing it back when she emailed or copied the bosses. I know this sounds very stupid, as she was leaving written evidence that easily proved she was misleading people. Some of these emails were forwarded in private to my wife by her co-workers. So basically, this witch is a classic A sweet talker, so she convinced the bosses to let her stick around for another month after my wife returned to work to organize and help finish up some procedural handbooks my wife started writing. but were actually the director of operations' responsibility. Her contract was renewed for another month so she could perform this very specific task. As this boundary was not defined in writing, she started to overstep it in every way she could. Number 1, sign herself up on a training course on the company's dime. Number 2, setting up on-site training courses for the staff, already quoted and kicked off by my wife with the external providers before her maternity leave. Also, to take credit for the coordination effort, leaving, however, loose ends. My wife decided to pick up the slack, as letting it slide would have affected both the employees and the training providers. Number 3, telling my wife in several instances in front of other employees that she needed to stay after hours to finish up certain tasks pertaining to her position, as a way to mark territory and establish dominance per se. Number 4, questioning my wife's decision, again in front of other employees, about scheduling meetings within tight schedules as well as her ability to keep up with them. Number 5, published a before and after manifest detailing all the improvements she supposedly made to the HR managing position, contrasting her tenure against my wife's. Number 6, treating representatives of various supplier companies unjustifiably like dirt in a twisted and sick way to assert dominance maybe. Also, a particularly nasty phone call was overheard by the administrative director. Number 7, several similar instances of these 6 examples. Here is where my wife got fed up. She started her pro-revenge. From each of the above instances, these actions were taken. Please match the numbers. First, my wife contacted the training company to let them know that an error was made with the trainee's name, which should be the company's HR manager. So my wife set the training course for herself, as she was entitled to, being, you know, the actual HR manager, and deferred it for a later date. Also, she let her bosses know, but not the temp witch who showed up for the nighttime course only to find out she was not allowed to take it. Number 2. As my wife had way more time interacting with the on-site training provider, on the first day of the training week, the trainers came in looking for my wife to help them set up everything. On the last day's wrap-up meeting, they commended her for all her effort taken to make the training week a success. Temp witch left the room in a huff. Number 3 and 4, my wife replying to Temp Witch right then and there on each occasion that she was in no way taking her precious family time to work after hours and that she had enough ability to get done all tasks and meetings within her normal working hours. And then do exactly that on some days even with time to spare. My wife had a private meeting with the director of operations to talk mainly about the before and after manifesto as well as everything else mentioned above. My wife's point of view was that the company should not have allowed all this to happen unless of course they intended to fire my wife and keep Temp Witch as HR manager. The director of operations apologized profusely to my wife, assuring her that this was not the case at all and told her that the administrative director, after overhearing Temp Witch's nasty phone call, decided that she didn't want her to be part of the company in any way, shape or form, and then commissioned director of operations to take care of it. The director of operations called Temp Witch to a private meeting on a Friday, during which she informed her that her services were no longer needed. The director of operations relied that she was aware Temp Witch was past the 3-month mark, so she was entitled to some severance compensation. Temp Witch asked to be able to respond to this the next Monday. On Monday, Temp Witch presented Director of Operations with a positive pregnancy test. Yes, you read that right. And told Director of Operations that they now had to negotiate, citing the 6-month salary compensation law for dismissing pregnant employees. Temp Witch expressed that she saw no need for her to be fired and she very much preferred to remain on the company as an employee. The Director of Operations told Temp Witch that she needed to get back on her about this and scheduled a meeting for a few days later. The Director of Operations met with Administrative Director, who reiterated that she felt Temp Witch should not be part of the company, so the Director of Operations turned to my wife to start the dismissal and compensation procedures. Here is where my wife's revenge gets really pro. With the help of my co-workers, my wife got more detail about Temp Witch, previous employment and marketing major background, which allowed her to get publicly available info from a job search/application website about Temp Witch, which constituted irrefutable proof that she falsified her credentials to get hired by the company in the first place. My wife did not even bother to tell me about this at the time, as at the moment I was in the middle of a very stressful work trip. I made a dossier of printed out emails on which Temp Witch was making herself known as the HR manager to lower level employees, suppliers and contractors. She was told when hired that she had to clear up to all suppliers both verbally and in writing that she was acting on behalf of the HR manager, aka my wife. My wife then met with the director of operations and presented her with all this evidence. My wife said that it took a great effort to pry director of operations' jaw off the floor. My wife stressed that it was in the company's best interest that Tempwich should be required to retake the pregnancy test within the company's healthcare facility. As I'm sure you already guessed, the test came back negative with no evidence of a recent miscarriage. The director of operations purposely scheduled Tempwich's meeting on the same day my wife had to meet with company's employees on one of the other locations. Basically to avoid any uncomfortable situations, but she was told later that Tempwich somehow managed it to keep it together until she was showed the door. As it is part of her duties, my wife knows for a fact that the resignation letter signed by Tempwich is on file with the company and that no monetary compensation whatsoever was paid to Tempwich. And wow, Ripe Stars, I gotta say, you definitely don't wanna mess with OP's wife in this story. She is a complete badass. And with this, we have reached the end of the video. However, if you cannot get enough of my content, please check out my endless playlist, where you can find thousands of hours of content. In addition, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel to not miss any of my daily uploads. Thank you so much in advance, and I hope to see you again tomorrow.